You as well.
Thank you. Let's just, oh.
We need the.
Do you want me to? Perfect. Good morning, all. My apologies. I'm going to do this in English because your English is better than my Danish. It's getting better, but it's not quite good enough. So my sincere apologies about that. I suppose I'm going to really set a bit of a scene over the next 25, 30 minutes. And the kind of general hypothesis I want to put forward to you is that, and what we're really discussing, is that the nature of the problems that we are facing are requiring us to re-examine some of the deep codes and the kind of structural ideas that we've had about where value lies, how we own, how we consider, and how we share value. And those things are actually being enabled by a new round of technologies in a way that we've not been able to do. A very benign example, and the first generation example, you could argue is a little bit like Airbnb. Airbnb is in a way a boring revolution, where the transaction costs of sharing have become so significantly low that you can share on a global platform and be able to share space in a way that was historically impossible. Now, we all used to have lodges, people used to come and stay with us. That was physically possible. What Airbnb was able to do was create a transaction market in a way that was historically impossible. And the revolution here is the transaction cost of administration has gone to near zero as a function of cloud technologies and other functions. So, but that I'm going to put forward to is just a tip of an iceberg. Many of us are used to talking about new things, new buildings, new realities in a kind of physical sense and a services sense. But the revolution I think we want to put forward to you is that there's a revolution going on about how we contract, how we property rights and nature of property rights, how we govern, that is going to have profound implications for our cities and the places we operate. So zonal planning which says this place must be an event space, is just a function of how we dealt with nuisance issues to do with actually, we didn't want a factory right next to somebody living close by. Right now in Oxford Circus, you've got a Nike store which is able to produce print shoes for people to be able to take home. Is that a factory? Is it a retail store? So not only are we seeing the uses hybridize, the reality is with new governance mechanisms, we can pretty much bypass use classes to look at the impact, how much noise is produced, how much footfall is produced, how much sort of smells are produced, all sorts of effects, and you can govern the effects, not the function. The function was a proxy to our method of thinking and dealing with structural issues. Just that one possibility, change has massive implications for the organization of land value, organization of residual value, because housing is a significantly higher value in most cities right now than many other places. And these sort of experiments are already in trial. So the basic thesis that we're putting forward is that this boring stuff underground, which hasn't genuinely been the focus of many professionals and many leaders in the industry because we've been busy building the world, is actually being transformed. And that transformation has implications for how we think about many, many things. So let's hopefully this will wake up. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, perfect. So now, in a way, I would argue that world has changed. And this is the kind of very quick diagram, some of the big issues that we have. Actually, what we're seeing is a whole bunch of possibilities, whether it's smart covenants, new types of IP law, real-time pricing of patents, micro-patenting, outcome-based rental contracts. There's a whole bunch of things coming which are changing the nature of how we operate and deal with implications further upstream. I'm going to give you an example of the nature of complexities that we're dealing with as well. And we'll get back on theme in a way in a few minutes as well, which Mikkel will also take us through. So this is a really good, I think it's a very telling analysis of the UK net wealth. And what you realize here is for all the sale of unicorns and tech giants and all of that stuff, where has value been stored? It's land. Land has been the predominant net wealth, it's gone up 5 times versus every other asset class in the UK net wealth chart. Every other asset class. The question is why? And this is where I think it gets very interesting. This is a piece of, I don't know how many of you read a book, Capitalism Without Capital by Stephen Westlake. I really recommend it to you because his co-author is actually advising the Bank of England. And what he's talking about is the reason why land has gone up is not the usual market supply and demand issue. It's the nature of fundamental transformation in the nature of our economy and the assets we create. So we've gone from being a tangible assets economy, selling tables and other things, to an intangible assets economy. An intangible assets economy has a fundamentally different characteristic. Whereas tangible assets you can trade, if a company fails you can sell your tables. Intangible assets are sunk, synergistic, highly interwoven, and are actually driven by place. And land in that economy becomes a fundamental rent-seeking mechanism of that value. So Peter Thiel, many of you will know, the big investor behind Facebook and many other things, he says, what does he fund? He funds real estate. And sitting on top of that is a little bit of founders. Most of his money, he's allocated it, goes on funding buildings, where they work, where they sleep. Actually, the cost of living is a very small margin in that thesis. And there's some really good research even Elizabeth Warren has done about the nature of rent seeking in the land economy. And these are functions of complex realities. And other things are going on, which I think are worth us recognizing. So, this is a healthcare costs attributed to poor housing. If you have a badly insulated house, actually where does the cost go? The cost doesn't go just in energy bills, or it goes to your health service. In the UK, there's been a group of GPs who've turned around and taken their money and invested in improving the housing of social housing in order to reduce their costs. So these are budgets starting to actually cross and contaminate each other to deal with their systemic risks. We keep going. This is a brilliant piece of work that was done in 2001, which looked at million-dollar blocks, which said actually urban blocks, I think it was in both Chicago, but all the other neighborhoods, which cost the state $1 million a year in reoffending costs. So if you wanted to invest back, how could you look at future liabilities for the state and invest to mitigate those liabilities? So these are fundamentally business models and value models which are looking at future liabilities and bringing investment back into the table in new formats. And social impact bonds have tried to do that, but we've seen virtually no business models, certainly in the real estate and the place-based investment, which look at social costs and bring them back into the real estate model. We know we're starting to see some of those things. Again, I'm just going to give you some sort of high level. This is obviously peat, so it's very pixelated. So peat bogs in Scotland. We have them all literally over the north, so Scotland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, all the way through to Canada, Russia. Peat is degrading around the world. This landscape is degrading. It stores 10 times as much carbon as any of the forests in any of our urban forests, 10 times as much carbon. It's degrading because of actually temperature rise and other things. If peat effectively releases all its carbon, we're absolutely doomed. So how do you build an economy around actually maintaining that environment is going to be vital. So we're working with the Scottish National Investment Bank to look at how you build the economy around that. And here, interesting questions get asked. One of the questions was, say if you own a land with a forest, do you own the rights for the carbon sequestration of that forest? Currently you do. What happens if you own a piece of land, you don't own automatically the oil rights on that land? They're independent. You have to buy them with the state. So how do you start to think about environmental service rights? So we're talking about delaminating environmental services from the land value in parts of Scotland. So they're creating an environmental services market. That's now possible because you can do digital land rights in a way that was historically impossible. We can also measure using satellite data how much carbon is being sequestered or not sequestered or released. We can then even do real-time pricing on those licenses or liabilities to landowners. entirely with satellite data. So we can create new forms of actually markets and frameworks that have historically not been possible. Here we get more back to home. So flooding, and many of you will know this, certainly in the US, is the third highest public risk exposure. Third highest, after Medicare and Social Security. That exposure is kind of interesting, and the experts, and I am not an expert in flooding, so many of you will be, but the experts on this are really interesting. So people tend to often talk about, this, which is the mean, the average sea level rise that's going on. The average sea level rise is interesting, but what's even more interesting is the storm rises that you get, because that's where your flooding occurs, right? So you have two types of problems, and then you also have rainwater increases, which usually coincide with stormwater. Now, here's a little test. New York is looking to build a flood defense mechanism, investing $119 billion. Right? That defense mechanism will work, I think they're projecting it to work to about 2080, 2090. So the land it protects, what is the value of that land and how should we consider it? So after 80 years, that land is worthless unless we reinvent the wall. So that land is not like infinite value property. It is like a consumer durable with an 80-year lifespan, after which it becomes next to nothing, unless we reinvest in the wall. So suddenly the value of land is a function of actually that wall. What does that mean in terms of actually property valuation, property structuring, distribution of that value, who pays for it, how is it structured? So land and property becomes a space-time function, not a perpetual residual value function, linked to property. I think that's fascinating. So if property now becomes a consumer durable, sort of which you're amortizing away over 80 years, how do you build buildings? Now, the other part of this story that becomes even more interesting is we are already seeing the implications. Jakarta, you will know, is actually looking to move it's moving, right? It's sinking rapidly, and they're looking to move the capital city of Indonesia out. So we're going to see pretty significant transformations of our urban real estates. And we know the problem, everyone keeps going, oh, flooding, let's look at Amsterdam. The reality is, Amsterdam was designed this way, and even for them, there's strategic issues. Because reverse engineering, we've got groundwater levels rising, which are going to put pressure on all the foundations. We've got effectively the inability to be able to pump. Are we going to pump that groundwater away? How are we going to pump it? Actually, stormwater. So we've got rainwater increases. How do we deal with that? I think last year there was some flooding around here. So this is a complex issue. The question is, how is that value? Who's going to pay for it? How? And when the scale of that value becomes that 80% of the world's population lives on the water or near the water, who's going to pay for it? And so these are structural questions, but I suppose the underlying question here for me is we're able to do some interesting things in terms of how you link investments to those positions. And there's some fascinating work we're doing, say, in Canada, looking at the risk of flooding, and this is inland, so it's actually slightly less dangerous to do with rainwater associated flooding risks. And what they're looking at is actually how do you pool risk? And I'll give you some examples around how you create pooled risk mechanisms. So the underlying thesis I want to say is that many of these realities are now becoming tangled. Yet most of our thinking is based on silo models of, well, somebody will build this and we will be okay. But actually these values are now becoming much more entangled in those systems, and our responses have to deal with the nature of complexity. And the complexity, this is just obesity. This is the drivers of obesity. But I use it, it's a good signifier, because most people end up thinking it's a one-to-one problem. It's not, it's a many-to-many problem. And actually what you end up having to do is there's no one solution, but there's a whole category of solutions. So this is a portfolio of experiments that we're developing in Stockholm, working with the Stockholm region, which you have to think about experimentation, not from a single point perspective, because we know this is not going to be solved from single point issues. So how do you build the capacity to drive change in some of that stuff is going to be really critical. And these experiments go at multiple levels. So I'm going to keep moving forward. So one of the things that I want to say is that actually what we're seeing is that ability to transform the contractual relationships and the relationships between parties or the investment to other things is going to open up new boundaries and new opportunities to deal with some of these systemic risks. And also to deal with some of the systemic risks that we face as builders of cities, where actually the risk doesn't pass through, right? So many of you will know about the issue in Grenfell in the UK. Actually, what we are seeing is, actually, whether we like it or not, architects are theoretically responsible to the public good, not to the developers or the contractors that pay them. Theoretically, this is the truth. But the reality is, it's not. The reality is, actually, the liability really and the kind of accountability really goes to the client in quite a genuine sense. So how do we rebuild a new type of shared liability to the public realm? How do we rebuild an accountability of the architect to the building and its long-term utility? And what's interesting is you can create new models of warranties, new models of actually pass-through of risks. How do we start to collaborate in the sharing of risk in new formats? There's even a conversation going on about architects should be responsible to the building and its long-term utility rather than individuals or the contractor or its client, and which changes the nature of the flow of this stuff. So we know we have problems right now in terms of the failure to manage complexity because we're trying to manage complexity through one-to-one relationships. And in a way, one of the big things we have to do is look at the transition of value. This is from healthcare, but it's a useful frame. Design costs are 10%, total design costs maybe. 1 is your capital costs. 1.5 is your cost of building maintenance. 8 is your performative value of humans, right? So we were talking about this the other day. What's interesting for me is this room is probably now going up to maybe 750 parts per million in CO2, maybe around that level, maybe a little higher. Typically, in some rooms, you get up to 2,500 carbon parts per million. You get up to that level. What you'll find is that actually very few buildings are actually optimized to optimize humans. And we know that your IQ level drops as your parts per million go over even 300, 350. So we already know. And so how many buildings are actually optimizing towards humans? So real estate, the co-working boom, and some people don't like this, but the co-working boom was nothing to do with collaboration. In fact, all the evidence goes the other way. All the evidence is saying in a complex, attention-seeking world, actually what you need is private space. That's the most valuable component. Yet, we build more and more open-plan workspaces. And actually what we do know is connectivity drops, communication drops in open-plan offices rather than the other way. And what we also know is why? Because we're trying to optimize real estate. How often have you said, how much is your square feet usage? How less have you spoken about is how much has it improved productivity? What is the relationship to productivity is, I think, going to be more and more profound and central. And that's just CO2 levels are just one issue. I can name 100 other issues that deal with this. So, and when real estate is only 10% of an organization's cost and 50% is its people, what should you be optimizing? Real estate or the performative capacity of the humans that sit in the room? And where are we? And how do you build those contractual relationships to be able to do that? So you can, that's the really interesting thing. What happens if you start to link that performative contract not just to square feet, but actually some of the performative impacts of that environment? So the big thesis is, in a way, what we design and what the rules around it are fundamentally evolving. And our ability to evolve the rules and the contracting mechanism and the governing mechanism is going to change our capacity to how we share and organize value or share or organize risk. And that, as a quick summary, is a boring revolution. And I think for practitioners, for academics, this is well known. For practitioners, and certainly I've built OpenDesk, open source furniture company, WikiHouse, open source housing. What we got obsessed by was making things. What we very quickly realized was, unless you changed the warranty infrastructure, you couldn't make into this world at the same scale that you needed to. So, and this changes the whole stack of things, whether it's future of land, licensing, regulation, design mechanisms, construction, operation, even the financing tools that we're getting. So debt and equity are very classic tools, right? Revenue-based financing, real-time revenue-based financing becomes much more viable in digital corporations, which transcend the problem of debt. Debt is a fixed instrument, giving fixed returns. Equity requires governance. Actually, both of those are problematic for different reasons. Whereas actually you can do real-time revenue sharing. Robo-funds are already doing that in the US. What happens when we start to build new financing instruments to deal with both volatility and decentralized governance? So, and all sorts of things change. In a way, dynamic incentives, our regulatory frameworks can have dynamic incentives, we can have parametric standards, we don't have to have fixed standards, we can have contingent standards, so based on the density of use, we can change all of the things that were fixed and make them dynamic. That in itself is a single point revolution. And you can, as this is some of the stuff we've been exploring, looking at new models of warranties, all the way through to new models of property rights. Title deeds, energy. So energy rights can be traded independently from the use rights, from the development rights, from the future development rights. And what's even more crazy is you can tax them differentially. You don't have to deal with them as single property model. You can tax them differentially and be able to organize. So future development rights may be taxed at a completely different right. What would happen? And being able to trade those independently. And this goes from point of view of use of licensing. This is some stuff we're doing. In terms of being able to license use, you can do real-time licensing rather than actually trying to have fixed use clauses. So in that thesis, all of this stuff becomes possible. Smart receipts, smart property rights, various other things. So, but there are examples now already out there. So this is Reef Capital. I don't know how many of you know Reef Capital. They're a brilliant organization that have basically turned around and insured a beach in Mexico. They took the properties, insured the beach, all the properties on the beach, and then effectively restored the reef, which lowered the risk of flooding to those beach properties. So that by insuring them, what you did was crystallize the risk. Once you could crystallize the risk, you could hedge against that risk by actually naturally hedge against that risk by restoring the reef. Sounds crazy, but it's a really interesting way of pooling risk. So it was a pooling of risk at the same time of actually doing natural restoration. Those sort of contracts don't have to be static anymore. The pooling can be organized at a much more efficient level. The transaction costs are virtually near zero. How do we start to open these sort of opportunities up? I'm going to skip past this one. So another one that I'll talk about is the High Line in New York. Again, it's a very interesting example. How many of you know the High Line? Pretty much all right. So the High Line in New York cost $278 million to build. 70% of it was funded by state and federal and state, actually. 20% of it, 25% of it was funded by philanthropy, and about 5% of it was funded by citizens. How many years do you think it would have taken if you just shared 10% of the land uplift value, not total land value, attributable to the High Line? So when you got rid of all of the Manhattan increase that had happened, 19% increase annually, if you got rid of all of that, how many years do you think it would have taken to pay back for the High Line if you just took 10% of the attributable uplift value? 2 months?
Yeah, same.
10 months. Best business model there is. I don't know of any real estate function that can do as well as that. 10 months and you would have got the value back. The really interesting thing is what that's all about is how do you construct the kind of geospatial data, how do you link that to property rights, how you build a valuation engine, which is actually increasingly there because New York does an annual valuation cycle. So how do you do ownership verification? And then how do you measure it? So this is some of the work that we've been doing of actually building that data set. And then how do you democratically, like a community, like a business improvement district, get people to vote to say, yes, we want the High Line, and we will share 10% of the uplift value attributable to it? How do you democratically do that vote? So if you can do the vote, I lose nothing, because if there's no uplift value attributable to it, I don't have to pay anything. I only pay at the point of transaction, i.e. when I sell my property. So suddenly these sort of contracts and the title deeds, HMRC have made digital title deeds, are increasingly possible. So when you start to build this infrastructure, we're able, and the key point here is, we're able to pool and organize distributed risk or value and organize investment against that or for that, right? This is the underlying thing. The transactional infrastructure has gone near zero. This goes to other things, urban forests. Paris is investing 1.5 billion euros into building a new sewer, or was looking to do that. And they were looking to invest 1.5 billion to deal with rainwater and the expected rainfalls that they're having and to deal with flooding risk. Another way of dealing with it was to invest build 623 micro-urban forests all across Paris, which would be like sustainable urban drainage mechanisms. Why could they not build the forests, which were going to cost them half the money? Why were they more willing to build the sewers?
Property rights.
Huh?
Property rights.
Property rights, yeah, complexity of property. Accounting. Trees are a cost. The sewer sat on the balance sheet of the city. It was half the money. So what they started to think about, and we've been sort of talking with them and working with them, but also Milan, is, well, how do you construct effectively a proper environmental services company which provides those services? And how do you construct actually some of those infrastructures? Because we know trees not only provide sustainable, if located well and geographically organized, not only can they deal with sustainable urban drainage, they can deal with actually most of our cities are going to go up not 2.5 degrees in temperature, they're going to go up to about 4.5 degrees in temperature in peak time because of heat island amplification effects. So in order to deal with that, actually trees can actually dampen it by up to 2 degrees, and if you do a lot of them, you can do significant microclimate effects, almost biogeoengineering effects, because the moisture they release actually can change cloud form, rainfall patterns as well, and cooling temperatures. So when you can start to look at the bioengineering capacities of these urban forests, and you can start to take off 2 degrees in peak load, that is incredibly valuable in terms of capital investment, in terms of dealing with your energy peak load demand. So how do you start to build radical new business models that deal with this reality is increasingly possible. Oops, sorry, I just jumped. Is increasingly possible. And there's lots of, and that's just two components. There's also carbon sequestration effects. So you can suddenly create a complex business model of environmental services around trees that we could never do before, because the bureaucratic cost of organizing and managing it would be too high. It's not that, and we used to do them, right? Covenants have existed in history before. Churches were repaired and funded by local housing previously. But it's a scale and complexity that actually of transactions in urban centers is more and more difficult to do. And this goes to other examples. So again, I'll just repeat the same point. So what we're starting to see, whether it's a High Line, this could be a social cost or a social investment. Social investment or civic investment actually generates spillovers. Those externalities, positive, secondary, first and second order spillovers. We're increasingly in a position to be able to capture those spillovers, which fundamentally changes the business model of urban interventions. That can be done on cost, that can be done on liabilities, that can also be done on value. And the hybridity of building complex machined business models is changing the reality of these things. And dealing with all sorts of issues, whether natural assets, property, collaborative data, so urban data trusts, how do you fund them, hybrid infrastructure to deal with flooding, which is a mixture of pumps and other things, and also pumps require energy, continuous energy demand. How do you deal with that? So you can start to build quite different models of dealing with these sort of new forms of infrastructure. And again, going back, this all opens up a whole new thesis of this underlying structure. And I'll go back to the kind of thesis. You know, if suddenly property or that land is a function of $119 billion worth of investment, that land is a time function with a very with durability, after which it will diminish, it will have no value. How do we construct property rights in that era and the value transference? So the boring revolution for us, and you're contributing, we haven't gone public with this as the beginning of a thesis, is actually saying all of these things, the stuff that we don't really care about or we think, you know what, somebody else will deal with it, licensing, contracting, regulation, policy, rights, are fundamentally changing and evolving. And the kind of provocation I would say to you is the notion of the private economy was a function of private contracting, i.e. I could contract with you because actually that's the only most efficient way of actually making a contract. Because we would have lawyers working to each other. Now, when you can contract many to many, fundamentally you challenge the notion of value creation as being a private act to being a many to many act. That opens up a whole new class of value formation that didn't exist theoretically before. And I suppose I'm going to pretty much end. There are open questions in this, and I think these sort of things have to be dealt with. So all sorts of, and no way are we firstly claiming we're experts, because I'm not sure there is any one expert. Actually, there's lots of people. We would need behavioral economists in the room, contract law experts, a whole bunch of new types of microeconomy experts, because these are not static business models. They're actually transference of value in a rich format. So in no way, I think, are we claiming to be experts. I think this is going to require a whole field of interest and actors and experts to work together to create this economy. But they are fundamentally interesting questions. Metrics. I mean, how many of you read the book Tyranny of Metrics? Really recommend it. One of the real challenges that we have in most of the outcome-based formats that we have is that metrics drive gamification. And the gamification is deeply problematic. So that's why social impact bonds really only are 1 or 2 year cycles, because we cannot do long-term outcome-based contracts because actually the gamification perverses the outcome. So how do you start to construct any of this machined reality beyond gamification theory? Another key thing is construction of civic legitimacy. Most of the thing we're talking about when you're talking about many-to-many frameworks is the construction of civic legitimacy is going to be vital. So how do you construct it? The platforms and the organizations to do that and the metric models are going to be increasingly critical in dealing with that. And these are just some of the things that are coming up for us as being essential. And in a way, I suppose I would say these sort of examples open up a whole field of examples that would be, digital space licensing, new forms of policy, construction contracts, property rights. All these things will open up new possibilities of our city. And in a way, that's why we're honored that you're all here to explore some of this stuff with us. And again, I think the word key here is exploration. And actually, there's going to be many, many more people involved to test and explore these realities. So with that, I thank you for your patience in listening to me in English. I'm deeply honored. Thank you.